The crack of the gavel felt like a physical blow, but Elara Vance didn't flinch. In the sterile, merciless theater of the Manhattan family court, she was the lead actress in a tragedy, and her only line was silence. Her ex-husband, the charismatic private equity shark, Julian Croft, smirked as the judge read the verdict, stripping her of everything. The whispers in the gallery painted her as a fool, a woman so broken she couldn't even speak for herself. But what they saw as weakness was a calculated, devastating strategy. They didn't know her silence was a shield protecting a secret so monumental, it was about to shatter the world of everyone who had wronged her. Because 5 days later, a single press release would turn those whispers into stunned gasps. The silent, defeated ex-wife was about to be introduced to the world by a different name, the sole heiress to the billion-dollar Blackwood fortune. This is the story of how a woman's quietest moment became her loudest victory. The courtroom was a symphony of quiet cruelties. The squeak of a lawyer's leather shoe on the polished floor, the rustle of papers that detailed the dismemberment of a life, the almost inaudible sigh from the judge. For Elara Vance, however, the loudest sound was the confident, rhythmic tap of her ex-husband's Mont Blanc pen against his pristine legal pad. Tap, 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 a metronome counting down the final seconds of her old life. Julian Croft sat across from her, a portrait of effortless victory. His suit, a custom Tom Ford creation, probably cost more than the alimony he was so vehemently fighting against. Beside him, his lawyer, Marcus Thorne, a man with a predator's smile, shuffled his documents with the smug air of a chess master who had his opponent in checkmate in 3 moves. "Ms. Vance," Judge Albright said, her voice edged with a weary impatience that had been building all morning. "The court has asked you a direct question. Mr. Croft's counsel has presented evidence suggesting you willfully mismanaged marital assets, leading to the failure of your art gallery. Do you have any response to these allegations?" Elara looked up. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, met the judge's for a fleeting moment. She saw not malice but frustration. Here was a woman who just wanted to clear her docket to move on to the next broken family. Elara's gaze then drifted to Julian. He leaned forward slightly, a glint of anticipation in his eyes. He wanted her to fight. He wanted her to cry, to scream, to deny it all with the frantic, messy passion he had always despised in her. He wanted a show. She gave him nothing. Her own lawyer, a kind but overwhelmed public defender named David Brown, nudged her gently under the table. "Elara, please," he whispered, his voice a strained plea. "Say something. Anything. Tell them about the accounts he locked you out of. Tell them how he diverted the funds." Elara's hands remained perfectly still in her lap. She had given David the full story, but with one critical instruction: he was to present the facts clinically. But she would not testify. She would not be cross-examined. She would not engage. David thought it was a strategy born of trauma, a psychological retreat. He couldn't have been more wrong. It was the most aggressive, calculated move of her life. Marcus Thorne rose to his feet, his voice booming with practiced theatricality. "Your Honor, the defendant's silence speaks volumes. It is the silence of culpability. For 2 years, my client, Mr. Croft, poured his hard-earned money into what he believed was his wife's dream. A dream that turned into a financial nightmare due to her, let's call it, artistic temperament when it came to finances. He is not asking for retribution. He is simply asking for a clean break, and for the court to recognize that he should not be penalized further by paying alimony to the very person responsible for such significant financial loss." It was a masterful twisting of the truth. The gallery had been Julian's idea, a vanity project for his arty wife that he could show off to his friends. He'd underfunded it from the start, and then when he'd met his younger, more malleable new girlfriend, Tiffany, he'd systematically siphoned money from the gallery's business accounts into his own private holdings, starving it of cash flow and creating the very failure he was now pinning on Elara. He hadn't just broken her heart. He had tried to break her spirit, to rewrite history so that she was not just the discarded wife, but the incompetent one. Ms. Vance, the judge repeated, her tone hardening, this is your final opportunity to address the court regarding the claim for alimony and the division of remaining assets. Your silence will be taken as acquiescence. Ilara felt the weight of every eye in the room. The pitying stares from strangers, the triumphant sneer from Julian, the worried glance from David. This was the moment of her public humiliation. She had walked into this marriage with a promising career as a historical art curator and a small but significant inheritance from her grandmother. She was leaving with nothing but a suitcase of clothes and a mountain of debt Julian had cleverly engineered to be in her name. The court was about to formalize it. She took a slow, deliberate breath. She looked directly at Julian, holding his gaze. A flicker of confusion crossed his face. He was expecting tears, a tremor of the lip. He saw only a serene, unnerving stillness. She gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head to her lawyer. David Brown slumped in his chair, defeated. My client has no statement, Your Honor. The gavel fell. In light of the evidence presented and the defendant's refusal to contest the claims, Judge Albright declared, the court rules in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Croft. The request for spousal support is denied. All outstanding business debts associated with the Vance Gallery are assigned to Ms. Vance. The marital apartment and its contents are awarded to Mr. Croft. This marriage is hereby dissolved. The sound echoed, finalizing her erasure. Julian Croft subtly pumped his fist under the table. Marcus Thorne clapped him on the shoulder. Ilara stood up, her movements measured and calm. As she turned to walk out of the courtroom, she could hear Tiffany, who had been sitting in the back row, whisper excitedly to a friend, He's free. It's finally over. We can go to Aspen next week. Ilara didn't look back. She walked past the rows of benches, her back straight, her head held high. She felt the sting of their judgment like 1,000 tiny needles, but beneath it a cold, hard certainty was beginning to form. They thought they had witnessed an ending. They had no idea they had just witnessed the beginning. She walked out into the hazy New York afternoon, a woman with nothing to her name. And for the first time in years she felt utterly, completely, and dangerously free. 2 years earlier, Ilara had left Julian. It wasn't a dramatic plate-smashing affair. It was a quiet departure on a Tuesday morning while he was in a board meeting. She had packed a single bag, leaving behind the sprawling Soho loft that had become a gilded cage, its minimalist white walls a constant screaming reminder of the color that had been bleached from her own life. The first few months were a blur of temp jobs and cheap coffee. She worked as a barista, a dog walker, a freelance fact-checker for a dry academic journal. The humiliation was a constant companion, but it was sharper, more honest than the veiled condescension she had endured in her marriage. Julian had loved the idea of her, the brilliant, cultured art historian who looked good on his arm at fundraisers. He had systematically dismantled the reality of her, criticizing her research, mocking her passion projects, and slowly convincing her that her ambitions were childish fantasies. It was during this period, while working at a small, perpetually rain-streaked cafe in the West Village called The Daily Grind, that she met Alistair. He wasn't Alistair then. He was just Mr. Ash, an elderly man, who came in every afternoon at precisely 300 p.m. He was tall and stooped, with a shock of untamed white hair and eyes that were a startlingly bright blue. He dressed in worn, comfortable corduroys and tweed jackets that smelled faintly of old books and Earl Grey tea. He always ordered the same thing: black coffee, 1 sugar, and a seat by the window where he would read thick, leather-bound books and stare out at the bustling street. Most of the staff ignored him, seeing him as just another piece of the cafe's furniture. But Ilara, with her curator's eye for detail, noticed things. The quality of his worn leather shoes. The quiet authority with which he held himself even when lost in thought. The way he treated everyone, from the busboy to the manager, with the same level of gentle, unassuming respect. Their friendship began with a book. He was reading a first edition of Homer's Odyssey in the original Greek. "A difficult voyage home," Ilara had said quietly as she refilled his coffee. He looked up, his bright eyes focusing on her for the first time. A slow smile spread across his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Indeed," he replied, his voice a low, pleasant rumble. "But the monsters are often less fearsome than the memories one is sailing away from." From that day on they spoke. Their conversations were never about the mundane. They talked about the use of lapis lazuli in Renaissance paintings, the disputed authorship of Shakespeare's later plays, the quiet genius of Emily Dickinson, the fall of Constantinople. In Mr. Ashe, Elara found an intellectual peer, a mind as curious and as hungry as her own. He never asked about her past, about why a woman who could debate the merits of Caravaggio's chiaroscuro was wiping down sticky tables for a living. He simply accepted her as she was in that moment. He listened. When she spoke about art, the passion she thought Julian had extinguished would flare back to life. She described the feeling of standing before a Rothko, the sublime, terrifying pull of its colors. She talked about the secret history of objects, the stories embedded in a hand-carved chair or a piece of Roman glass. "You don't just see things, Elara," he told her one afternoon, his gaze thoughtful. "You understand their soul." It was a profound validation, a single sentence that began to heal cracks within her she thought were permanent. He shared pieces of himself too, but always in oblique, allegorical ways. He spoke of building a business empire as if it were a grand, intricate tapestry, full of brilliant threads and dark, ugly knots. He lamented the loneliness of the view from the top of a mountain, the way the air grew thin, and the world below became abstract and distant. He spoke of a family lost to ambition and time of regrets that had settled deep in his bones. One day, as a cold autumn rain lashed against the cafe window, he seemed particularly melancholic. "Tell me, Elara," he said, stirring his coffee, though it had no sugar to dissolve, "if you were given a great power and immense capacity to shape the world, what would you do with it?" Elara thought for a moment, wiping a stray drop of water from the table. "I don't think I'd try to shape the world," she answered honestly. "It's too big, too stubborn. I think I'd try to protect the small, beautiful things that the world tries to crush. A young artist's talent, a forgotten piece of history, a quiet place for people to think. I suppose I'd build a sanctuary, not an empire." Mr. Ashe looked at her for a long time, his blue eyes searching her face. Then he nodded slowly. "A sanctuary," he repeated softly. "Yes, I think you would." Not long after, Mr. Ashe stopped coming to the cafe. The 3:00 p.m. lull felt empty, the chair by the window achingly vacant. Elara inquired at nearby hospitals and community centers, but no one had heard of a Mr. Ashe. He had vanished as quietly as he had appeared, leaving her with a renewed sense of her own worth and a deep, puzzling sense of loss. She had no idea that their quiet intellectual friendship in a dingy cafe was the single most important relationship of her life. She didn't know that Mr. Ashe, the lonely old man with the kind eyes, was Alistair Blackwood, the legendary reclusive titan of industry, a man so private that there were fewer than a dozen known photographs of him in existence. And she certainly didn't know that in his final months battling a silent illness, he had found in her the one thing his billions could never buy: a genuine human connection, untainted by greed or expectation. He had been testing her, observing her, and she had passed a test she never even knew she was taking. The 5 days following the divorce were a descent into a gray, featureless limbo. Elara moved into a small 6th-floor walk-up apartment in a less-than-fashionable part of Brooklyn, the kind of place where the hiss of the radiator was the only constant companion. The court's judgment was a tangible weight, a legal declaration of her worthlessness. Julian had made sure of it. He'd texted her once the day after the verdict. "Hope you enjoy your new life. Don't come crawling back when you can't pay your bills. Jay." She deleted it without replying. She spent her days sending out resumes for any position related to art or history, no matter how menial. The replies were sparse and discouraging. The failure of her gallery, now a matter of public record thanks to the divorce proceedings, was a black mark against her name. In the art world, where reputation was everything, she was radioactive. On the 5th day, a crisp Friday morning, a letter arrived. It wasn't shoved in her mailbox with the usual junk mail and bills. It was delivered by a courier, a stern-looking man in a sharp uniform who required her signature. The envelope was thick, made of heavy cream-colored cardstock. The return address was embossed in elegant, severe lettering. Sterling and Finch, LLP, Sterling Tower, 57th Street, Manhattan. Alara's heart seized. Sterling and Finch. She knew the name. Everyone knew the name. They weren't just lawyers. They were kingmakers and dynasty builders, the firm that handled the estates of the world's wealthiest and most powerful families. She immediately assumed it was a mistake, or worse, that Julian, in some final act of cruelty, had sicked his own high-powered legal team on her for some imagined slight or outstanding debt he'd manufactured. With trembling hands, she slid open the envelope. The letter inside was brief and formal. Dear Ms. Vance, this letter is to request your presence at our offices on Monday, September 22nd at 10:00 a.m. The meeting concerns a matter of utmost importance regarding the estate of a recently deceased client. Your prompt attendance is essential. Please ask for Eleanor Sterling upon your arrival. Sincerely, Eleanor Sterling, Senior Partner, Sterling and Finch, LLP. The estate of a deceased client. She racked her brain trying to think of any distant relative or acquaintance who would be represented by such a firm. There was no one. The Vances were a modest family of academics. Her mother was gone, her father estranged. It had to be a mistake. She spent the weekend in a state of anxious confusion. She Googled Eleanor Sterling and found a picture of a formidable woman in her late 60s, with silver hair cut in a severe bob and an expression that suggested she did not suffer fools gladly. She was legendary in the world of estate law, known for her discretion and her iron will. On Monday morning, Alara stood before Sterling Tower, a gleaming black skyscraper that seemed to pierce the clouds. It was a monument to power and wealth, a world away from her crumbling walk-up. Dressed in the only decent blazer she owned, she felt like an imposter. The lobby was a cavern of marble and polished steel, populated by people who moved with an effortless, expensive confidence. Taking a deep breath, she approached the reception desk. "I'm here to see Eleanor Sterling," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "My name is Alara Vance." The receptionist, a cool blonde who looked more like a model than an office worker, checked her screen. Her perfectly plucked eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. "Of course, Ms. Vance. Ms. Sterling is expecting you. 82nd floor." The elevator ride was a silent, stomach-churning ascent. When the doors opened, she stepped into a reception area that was more like a modern art museum. A massive Joan Mitchell painting hung on one wall, its vibrant chaos a stark contrast to the serene minimalist decor. A moment later, a door opened and Eleanor Sterling herself appeared. She was even more imposing in person. She wore a perfectly tailored gray suit, and her eyes, sharp and intelligent, seemed to assess Alara in a single sweeping glance. "Ms. Vance, thank you for coming," she said, her voice crisp and devoid of warmth. She didn't offer to shake hands. "Please come in." Alara followed her into a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking, godlike view of Central Park. The entire city sprawled beneath them. On the large mahogany desk there was only a single thick, leather-bound document. "Please have a seat," Ms. Sterling said, gesturing to one of the two chairs facing her desk. "Can I offer you some water, coffee?" "Water would be fine, thank you," Alara managed to say, her throat dry. As an assistant silently brought in a glass of water, Ms. Sterling sat down and placed her hands on the document. She fixed her gaze on Alara, her expression unreadable. "Ms. Vance," she began, getting straight to the point. "I was the personal attorney for a man named Alistair Blackwood. I don't know if you are familiar with the name." Alara shook her head. "No, I don't believe so." The name was vaguely familiar, perhaps from a business journal Julian used to leave lying around, but it meant nothing to her personally. "Mr. Blackwood was an intensely private man," Ms. Sterling continued. He passed away 2 weeks ago after a long illness. He had no living relatives. For the last 40 years I have been the sole executor of his estate and his will." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the silent room. Alara felt a growing sense of surreal dislocation. What could this possibly have to do with her? Mr. Blackwood's will was unconventional, Ms. Sterling said, her tone clinical. "He spent the last year of his life finalizing its terms. It is my duty to inform you of its contents." She opened the leather-bound folder. The document is extensive, detailing the disposition of various assets, trusts, and philanthropic foundations. But the primary clause is quite simple. Eleanor Sterling looked up from the page, and for the first time a flicker of something curiosity-wonder crossed her stoic features. It reads, "To Alara Vance, a woman of kindness and integrity, who saw a man and not a fortune, I hereby bequeath my entire remaining estate without condition or qualification. She was a sanctuary in my final days, and it is my wish that she now has the means to build her own." The room tilted. Alara gripped the arms of her chair to steady herself. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion. Alara Vance. Entire estate sanctuary. It made no sense. There must be a mistake," she stammered. "I don't know anyone named Alistair Blackwood." Ms. Sterling reached into a drawer and pulled out a simple framed photograph. She slid it across the desk. Alara looked down, and all the air left her lungs. It was him. Younger, yes, with dark hair and a confident smile, standing on the deck of a sailboat. But the eyes were unmistakable. The bright, intelligent, piercingly blue eyes. It was Mr. Ashe. The silence in the office was absolute, broken only by the frantic pounding of Alara's own heart. She stared at the photograph, her mind struggling to connect the two identities, the kind, unassuming Mr. Ashe from the cafe, and the mysterious, powerful Alistair Blackwood, whose name was now irrevocably linked to hers. "Mr. Ashe," she whispered the name, feeling foreign and inadequate on her tongue. A pseudonym he adopted in his later years. Eleanor Sterling confirmed, her voice softening almost imperceptibly. He grew weary of the sycophants and fortune hunters. He wanted to spend his final months experiencing the world without the distorting filter of his wealth. He found your cafe. He found you. Alara felt a wave of dizziness. Every conversation, every debate about art and philosophy replayed in her mind, now cast in a blinding new light. His talk of empires and lonely mountains, his question about what she would do with great power. It hadn't been idle chatter. It had been an interview, a final profound test. His entire estate. She asked, the words feeling absurd. What does that even mean? Ms. Sterling took a deep breath, as if preparing to launch a ship. It means, Ms. Vance, that as of the legal certification of his death last week, you are one of the wealthiest individuals in the world. The Blackwood estate is a diversified portfolio of assets valued after all taxes and obligations at approximately $9.7 billion. The number was so vast, so astronomical, that it didn't register as a real sum of money. It was a concept, an abstraction. Billion. With a B. It includes... Ms. Sterling continued, turning a page in the will. A controlling interest in Blackwood, consolidated a global logistics and technology firm, a real estate portfolio that includes this building, a 10,000-acre estate in upstate New York, a villa on Lake Como, a townhouse in Belgravia, London, and a private island in the Caribbean, a private art collection considered to be one of the finest in the world, with works by Monet de Kooning and a previously unknown Vermeer, and a liquid capital fund of over $2 billion. Alara felt like she was drowning. She shook her head, trying to clear it. But why me? We just talked. We had coffee. It seems those conversations were more meaningful to Mr. Blackwood than you can imagine, Ms. Sterling said. She then pulled a smaller sealed envelope from the folder. He also left this for you. A personal letter. He instructed that you read it before any documents were signed. Her hands shaking, Alara took the envelope. It was the same heavy, cream-colored paper. Her name was written on the front in a strong, elegant, slightly shaky hand. She broke the seal. My dearest Alara, if you are reading this, then my voyage has finally ended. I apologize for the deception of my name, but I hope you will understand. In my life, I built an empire of things of steel and code and concrete. But in my final year, I found myself impoverished in the ways that truly matter. I was surrounded by people who wanted something from me who saw only a vault to be opened. Then I met you. You, who were in the midst of your own quiet storm, offered me the simple, priceless gift of your time and your thoughts. You never asked for anything. You didn't even know there was anything to ask for. You spoke to me of beauty, of history, of the soul of things. In your presence, I was not Alistair Blackwood, the magnate. I was just Ash, a man listening to a brilliant woman. You told me you would build a sanctuary. I believe you. This fortune has been a gilded cage for me for too long. In your hands, I hope it will become a key, a tool to protect the beautiful things you spoke of, to foster the talent the world overlooks, and to build a life of your own choosing free from the shadows of your past. Do not let its weight crush you. Let it be the wind in your sails. Thank you, my dear friend, for the coffee and for the kindness. Yours, Alistair. Tears streamed down Alara's face, hot and silent. They weren't tears of joy for the money, but tears of grief for the friend she now realized she had lost, and of overwhelming gratitude for his staggering, incomprehensible faith in her. He had seen her when she felt invisible. He had valued her when the world and her own husband had declared her valueless. She finally understood her silence in the courtroom. It was a subconscious act of preservation, an instinct she hadn't fully understood at the time. If she had fought Julian, if she had argued over the scraps he was leaving her, her financial situation would have been a matter of intense legal scrutiny. If word of a potential inheritance had leaked, Julian and his lawyers would have descended like vultures trying to delay the divorce to lay claim to her future. Her silence had been a clean amputation. She had let him win the battle, severing their legal and financial ties completely, just days before the war was won by a force he couldn't have possibly imagined. She looked up at Eleanor Sterling, her eyes clear now despite the tears. A new resolve was hardening within her. The timid, broken woman who had walked into the courtroom was gone. "What do I need to do?" she asked, her voice steady and clear. A slow, genuine smile finally broke through Eleanor Sterling's professional facade. "First," she said, pushing a pen across the desk, "you sign here, Ms. Vance, and then we get to work." The announcement was not a headline. It was an earthquake. Sterling and Finch LLP, a firm known for its monastic silence, issued a terse 2-paragraph press release. It was a masterclass in understated bombshells. It announced the passing of their client, the reclusive Alistair Blackwood, and the execution of his final will and testament, which named one Ms. Alara Vance as his sole unconditional heir. The financial world went into a frenzy. Who was Alara Vance? The name was unknown. Journalists scrambled, digging into public records. Within hours they found it, a recent divorce filing in the Manhattan family court, Vance versus Croft. The details were salacious, and until now utterly insignificant. A failed art gallery owner, a humiliating legal defeat, a woman stripped of her assets and denied alimony just over a week ago. The narrative flipped with dizzying speed. Forbes, the silent heiress. How a down-and-out divorcee inherited the Blackwood billions. The Wall Street Journal. Blackwood's surprise successor. Vance inheritance sends shockwaves through Consolidated. Vanity Fair. The ultimate revenge. Julian Croft divorced his wife, days before she became a billionaire. Julian Croft was in a celebratory dinner with Tiffany at Per Se when his phone began to vibrate off the table. He ignored the first few calls, annoyed at the interruption. But then his phone, Tiffany's phone and the phones at the surrounding tables all began to light up. A low murmur swept through the restaurant. "Julian," Marcus Thorne's voice said, panicked and breathless when he finally answered. "Have you seen the news?" "I'm at dinner, Marcus." "What is it?" Julian snapped. "It's Alara. You need to turn on the TV or look at your phone. Now." Julian opened a news app. The first thing he saw was a picture of Alara. A candid shot of her leaving the courthouse, her expression serene and unreadable. Next to it was an old file photo of a man he vaguely recognized as the mythical Alistair Blackwood. The headlines swam before his eyes. He dropped his phone. It clattered onto his plate, scattering microgreens and truffle foam. "What is it, sweetie?" Tiffany asked, annoyed. "You've gone pale." Julian couldn't speak. The numbers, the headlines, the sheer impossibility of it all crashed down on him. $9.7 billion. He thought back to the courtroom, her silence, her infuriating placid calm. It hadn't been defeat. It had been control. She had known. She had to have known. She had sat there and let him publicly humiliate her, let him take everything, knowing she had $1 billion kingdom waiting for her. He hadn't won. He had been played. He had been made a cosmic world historical fool. A strangled sound escaped his lips, a mixture of a laugh and a sob. He began to shake, then erupted in a furious tire-chewing. "No! No! It's not possible! She's nothing! She's a failed artist!" The entire restaurant was now staring. Tiffany, mortified, tried to quiet him. "Julian, stop! You're making a scene!" But Julian was beyond reason. He shoved his chair back, nearly knocking a waiter over, and stormed out of the restaurant, his mind a raging inferno of greed, fury, and utter soul-crushing regret. His first call to Alara went to a disconnected number. She had already changed it. He then called her old lawyer, David Brown. "What can I do for you, Mr. Croft?" David asked, a newfound confidence in his voice. "This inheritance, it's marital property. We were married when she met this man. I'm entitled to half of it," Julian screamed into the phone. David Brown laughed, a quiet, satisfied chuckle. "I don't think you understand how this works, Julian. First, the inheritance was legally conferred after the dissolution of your marriage was finalized by a judge's gavel. The timing is, as they say, impeccable. Second, inheritance is almost universally considered separate, not marital property. You don't have a leg to stand on. You made sure the break was clean. Well, now it is. Have a nice life." The line went dead. The fallout was swift and brutal. The board of Julian's private equity firm, spooked by the public humiliation and the sudden instability of their star partner, called an emergency meeting. Whispers started that Blackwood Consolidated, now under new unpredictable ownership, might pull its massive pension funds from their management. Julian was suddenly toxic. Tiffany, seeing her future of Aspen trips and designer handbags evaporate, and seeing the man she thought was a winner revealed as a colossal loser, packed her bags. She left a short, cold note on the marble countertop of the apartment he had won in the divorce. Julian was left alone in the vast, empty loft, a place that now felt like a monument to his own stupidity. He had fought tooth and nail for this apartment, for the paintings on the wall, for the last dregs of their shared assets. He had gloated over winning a few $1 million worth of property from Alara, and in doing so he had forfeited his claim to billions. It was a miscalculation of such epic proportions that it would haunt him for the rest of his days. While Julian's world imploded, Alara's was expanding at an exponential rate. The first week was a whirlwind of meetings in the 82nd floor office at Sterling Tower, which she now learned was referred to as the Keep. She was introduced to a small, fiercely loyal team that had managed Alistair's empire for decades. A silver-haired CFO who could explain quantum financial derivatives with the patience of a kindergarten teacher, a sharp-witted head of operations, and Eleanor Sterling, who was her constant guide, her Virgil in this new glittering inferno of wealth. They didn't treat her like an ignorant interloper. They treated her like a queen whose coronation had been long awaited. They explained that Alistair had been preparing them for this, telling them his successor would be unconventional, but would have a moral clarity the company desperately needed. The transformation began on the inside. The fear and self-doubt that Julian had so carefully cultivated in her for years began to wither under the light of this new responsibility. She found that the skills she had honed as a curator, a sharp eye for detail, deep research abilities, an understanding of long-term value over short-term trends, and the ability to see the story behind the object were directly applicable to running an empire. She wasn't a finance shark, but she understood value in a way Julian never could. The external transformation followed. Eleanor Sterling arranged for a private consultation with a stylist. Alara didn't want to become a caricature of a wealthy woman. She rejected the flashy brands and opted for understated, elegant pieces from designers like the Row and Brunello Cucinelli clothes that conveyed quiet confidence, not loud status. She cut her long hair into a chic, shoulder-length style that framed her face and highlighted the intelligence in her stormy eyes. When she looked in the mirror, she saw not Julian's discarded wife, but the woman Alistair Blackwood had seen all along. Her first major decision stunned the board of Blackwood Consolidated. One of the company's most profitable but controversial divisions was in private prisons. It was a legacy part of the business Alistair had regretted but had never untangled. In her first board meeting, Alara, with Eleanor at her side, announced her intention to divest completely from the division, redirecting the capital into a new foundation for arts and education. There were gasps. The CFO calmly presented figures showing the tens of millions in annual profit they would be sacrificing. There are some things whose value can't be measured in profit margins. Alara stated, her voice calm and firm. The Blackwood name will no longer be attached to the caging of human beings for profit. This is not negotiable. The board, faced with the unshakable resolve of their new 100% shareholder, had no choice but to comply. The news of the divestment made headlines again, this time casting Alara not as a lucky heiress but as a bold, ethical leader. One weekend, Eleanor drove her upstate to see the Blackwood estate named Graymore. It wasn't a gaudy mansion, but a sprawling, elegant stone house nestled among rolling hills and ancient trees overlooking a vast, shimmering lake. Inside it was a sanctuary of books and art. The legendary private collection was not displayed ostentatiously, but hung and placed with a curator's love, as if the pieces were part of a conversation with each other. She walked through the halls, running her hand along the spines of thousand-year-old books in the library. She stood before the secret Vermeer, a small, luminous painting of a woman reading a letter by a window, and felt a profound connection to Alistair. He had bought these things not for status, but because he truly loved them. In a small study overlooking the lake, she found his desk exactly as he had left it. On it was a single worn copy of the Odyssey in Greek. Tucked inside was a pressed flower, a fading violet. Alara knew then that she was home. This wasn't a cage. It was the sanctuary she had spoken of in the cafe. It was now hers to protect and to share. She decided this would be the headquarters for her new foundation, a place where artists and scholars could come for residencies free from the financial pressures of the world, a place to foster the small, beautiful things. 3 months after the will was read, Julian Croft finally managed to secure a meeting. He had to go through 3 layers of lawyers, and the meeting was not granted at Alara's home or office, but in a neutral, sterile conference room at Sterling and Finch. The man who walked in was a ghost. His custom suits were gone, replaced by a slightly too large department store blazer. He had lost weight, and his trademark confident swagger was replaced by a twitchy, desperate energy. His private equity firm had forced him out. His friends had abandoned him, and he was drowning in legal fees from a half-dozen lawsuits filed by investors who had followed him into ruin. Alara sat at the head of the long table flanked by Eleanor Sterling. She was the image of composure and power. She no longer looked like the woman he had divorced. She looked like the woman who owned the building they were in. Alara, he began, his voice raspy. I wanted to talk to you. Alone. Ms. Sterling stays, Alara said, her tone leaving no room for argument. What do you want, Julian? He began a rambling, pathetic plea. He spoke of their shared history of the good times, conveniently forgetting the years of emotional abuse. He tried to claim that his business acumen had inspired her, that he was indirectly responsible for her good fortune. Finally, he got to the point. "I'm ruined, Alara," he said, his voice cracking. "Everything is gone. I'm asking you. No, I'm begging you. For a settlement, a small percentage, 1%, just enough to start over, for old times' sake." Alara listened without expression. When he was finished, a long silence filled the room. Julian looked at her expectantly, a flicker of hope in his hollow eyes. He still believed on some fundamental level that she was the same soft-hearted woman he could easily manipulate. "No," Alara said. The single word was not spoken with anger or hatred. It was spoken with the finality of a chapter closing. It was a simple statement of fact. "But why," he stammered, "after everything we had—" Alara finally looked at him, truly looked at him. She felt no desire for revenge, no satisfaction in his downfall. All she felt was a profound, weary pity for this small, grasping man. "You know, for years you told me my biggest weakness was that I was too sentimental," she said, her voice even and calm. "You told me I lived in a fantasy world of art and history, and that I didn't understand how the real world worked, how value was created and taken." She leaned forward slightly. "But you were wrong. My weakness wasn't sentimentality. It was you. And your biggest weakness, Julian, is that you can only see the price of things but never their value. You saw our marriage as a transaction. You saw our divorce as a hostile takeover. You see this inheritance as a stock price you missed out on." She stood up, the meeting clearly over. "Alistair Blackwood didn't leave me his money. He left me his trust. He valued my character when you told me I had none. He valued my passion when you called it a hobby. The money is just a tool. It's the byproduct of a life lived with integrity, something you will never understand." She walked towards the door, pausing with her hand on the handle. "You asked for 1% for old times' sake," she said, looking back at him one last time. "But the final verdict in our divorce, the one you celebrated so much, declared that our old times were worth exactly nothing. The court has already decided what you are owed by me. And I am a woman who respects the letter of the law." She walked out of the room without a backward glance, leaving Julian Croft alone at the vast, empty table, a billionaire in spirit, a beggar in reality, forever haunted by the fortune he threw away and the woman he never truly saw. Alara, meanwhile, stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, her future as wide and limitless as the sky above. The winter that followed was a season of quiet construction, not with brick and mortar, but with purpose. Alara chose to make the Greymore estate her home and the heart of her new operations. The vast book-lined library, once Alistair's solitary refuge, was now the nerve center of the newly established Blackwood Foundation. The world, having learned of her existence, now beat a path to her door. Sacks of mail arrived daily, request proposals and pleas from every corner of the globe. They were a testament to the raw, desperate hunger of the world, a scientist needing funding for climate research, a village in Peru seeking a clean water well, a musician who had lost her priceless cello in a fire. But mixed in with the genuine cries for help was the noise of opportunism. Letters from self-proclaimed inventors with perpetual motion machines, long-lost cousins with dubious genealogical charts, and investment gurus promising to double her fortune. Alara quickly learned that her greatest challenge was not the management of money but the stewardship of trust. Her past life had given her a painful but invaluable skill, the ability to discern the authentic from the performative. Julian's world had been built on the latter, and she had learned its language intimately. She sat by the grand fireplace one snowy afternoon, a stack of proposals on the antique table beside her, with Eleanor Sterling, who now served as the Foundation's chairwoman. "The capital appreciation on the tech portfolio is exceeding forecasts by 12%, Eleanor said, reviewing a spreadsheet on her tablet. "If we reinvest, we could add another $1 billion to the endowment within 3 years. Alara looked out the window, watching the heavy, silent snowflakes blanket the ancient oaks. Alistair didn't spend his last year finding an heir just so she could get richer, Eleanor. He wanted me to build sanctuaries. A noble goal, Eleanor conceded, her tone practical. But a sanctuary needs strong walls. The endowment provides that. I know, Elara said, turning back to her. But it's time to open the gates, even if just a little. I want to start the Blackwood Fellows program, here at Graymore. The idea was simple but radical. Each year they would select a small number of brilliant but struggling creators, artists, writers, composers, thinkers, and give them a year's residency at the estate. They would be housed in the beautifully renovated guest houses, given a private studio space, and most importantly, a generous stipend that would free them from all financial worry. The only condition was that there were no conditions. No required gallery show at the end, no demand for a finished manuscript, no expectation of a commercial product. The goal was to give them the one thing a creator needs most and is rarely afforded: absolute, untethered freedom. Eleanor, ever the pragmatist, raised an eyebrow. No deliverables. The board may call that inefficient. Let them, Elara replied with a small smile. Julian taught me everything I need to know about efficiency. It often leads to a beautifully organized life with no soul. This isn't an investment in a product, it's an investment in a person. The first Blackwood Fellow was a young painter from the Bronx named Sophia Reyes. Elara had discovered her work at a small, struggling gallery in Bushwick. Sophia's canvases were enormous, chaotic, and breathtakingly alive. She painted with a raw, visceral energy, depicting scenes of urban life with the emotional weight of classical history paintings. Elara saw in her a fire and a talent that the world was close to extinguishing. The gallery owner told her that Sophia worked 2 bartending jobs to afford her tiny studio and often had to choose between buying paint and buying food. Instead of sending a formal letter, Elara drove to the city and went to the address of the studio herself. It was a cramped cold-water loft above a tire shop. The smell of turpentine and linseed oil was overpowering. Sophia, a young woman with paint-smeared hands and wary, intelligent eyes, was openly suspicious when Elara introduced herself. I know who you are, Sophia said, crossing her arms. She didn't seem impressed. I read the papers. So what's this? The billionaire heiress is slumming it for a day. Want to buy a painting to make you feel good? Elara didn't flinch at the cynicism. She recognized it as armor. Actually, she said, her gaze drifting to a massive unfinished canvas depicting a crowded subway car, the faces a mixture of exhaustion and defiance. I'm here because I believe a talent like yours deserves to be loud and the world is forcing you to whisper. I'm here to offer you a megaphone. She explained the fellowship. Sophia listened, her skeptical expression slowly melting into one of utter disbelief. A year with a stipend, and I don't owe you anything at the end. Sophia asked, her voice laced with suspicion. What's the catch? Do I have to have dinner with your rich friends and perform like a trained monkey? No, Elara said softly. There's no catch. The only thing I ask is that you honor your gift, that you work without fear for 1 year. Why? Sophia asked, the single word hanging in the air between them. Why me? Elara thought of Mr. Ashe, of their quiet conversations in the cafe. She thought of how he had given her a priceless gift without ever asking for anything in return. Because a very wise man once gave me a sanctuary when I needed it most, Elara said. He didn't ask me to pay him back. He asked me to build my own. This is me laying the first stone. A few weeks later, Sophia Reyes moved into a sun-drenched studio in a converted barn on the Graymore estate, with a view of the frozen lake. Elara watched her from the library window on her first day. She saw the young painter stand before a huge blank canvas, her entire body thrumming with a kind of nervous, joyful energy. For the first time in years, Sophia was not thinking about her rent, her bills, or her next shift. She was thinking only of the art. In that moment, watching a stranger's dream ignite, Elara felt a sense of profound, quiet satisfaction that no stock market gain or legal victory could ever provide. The billion-dollar fortune was not a prize she had won. It was a responsibility she had inherited, and her life's work, she now understood, was not to be the heiress to a vast fortune, but to be the architect of its soul. Ilara Vance's story is a powerful reminder that the world often mistakes quietness for weakness and silence for defeat. She proved that integrity is a currency more valuable than any stock, and that kindness can yield dividends beyond any billionaire's wildest dreams. Her journey from a silent courtroom to the head of a global empire wasn't about the money. It was about reclaiming a voice she was told wasn't worth hearing. It shows us that sometimes the most strategic move is to let your enemies defeat themselves while you wait patiently for the life you truly deserve. What did you think of Ilara's calculated silence? Was it the ultimate power move or an incredible risk? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story of poetic justice and quiet strength as compelling as I did, please give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who needs a reminder of their own worth, and make sure you subscribe to the channel for more incredible true life stories. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Thanks for listening.
The sound of expensive heels clicking against marble floors echoed through the grand foyer of the Blackwood estate. Victoria Blackwood adjusted her pearl necklace one final time before pushing open the heavy oak doors to her husband's study. The scent of aged whiskey and cigar smoke greeted her, along with the low rumble of masculine voices discussing business deals that would reshape entire industries. "Richard, we need to talk about the Henderson acquisition," Victoria announced, her voice cutting through the conversation with practiced authority. Richard Blackwood, her millionaire ex-husband-to-be, though she didn't know it yet, barely glanced up from his conversation with three potential investors. His dismissive wave was as casual as swatting away an annoying fly. "Not now, Victoria. The men are talking business." The words hit her like a physical blow. 23 years of marriage had taught Victoria to read the warning signs in Richard's behavior. The tight set of his jaw when he was frustrated, the way his manicured fingers drummed against his crystal whiskey glass when he was losing patience, the dismissive tone that had grown more frequent over the past 5 years. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the quarterly reports spread across his mahogany desk showed discrepancies that could cost them both millions. Tonight, Victoria had discovered financial irregularities that demanded immediate attention, regardless of Richard's precious investor meeting. "This affects both our portfolios. Richard, the Henderson deal could cost us everything if you don't listen to what I found." The room fell silent. 3 sets of expensive suits turned to stare at her with varying degrees of annoyance and surprise. Richard's face flushed red above his perfectly knotted silk tie. "Damn it, Victoria, can't you see I'm in the middle of something important?" The physical push came without warning. Not hard enough to truly injure, but deliberate enough to send Victoria stumbling backward through the doorway into the marble hallway. Her designer heels scraped against the floor as she fought to maintain her balance. The study door slammed shut with a resounding bang that echoed through their sprawling Connecticut mansion, leaving her staring at the polished wood while masculine voices resumed their conversation behind it. Victoria stood in the hallway for a long moment, her reflection staring back at her from the antique mirror hanging opposite the study. 51 years old, impeccably dressed, perfectly coiffed, and completely invisible to the man she had spent more than 2 decades building an empire alongside. The woman in the mirror looked like someone who had everything money could buy. Designer clothes, professional makeup, jewelry worth more than most people's houses, but her eyes told a different story. They were the eyes of someone who had been slowly disappearing, piece by piece, decision by decision, until she barely recognized herself. 23 years, Richard, she whispered to the closed door. "And you just made your biggest mistake." Victoria walked slowly toward the grand staircase, her footsteps muffled by the Persian rugs that decorated their home. Each step felt like waking up from a dream she hadn't realized she was having. The push had been physical, yes, but it represented something much deeper. It was the culmination of years of being dismissed, ignored, and treated like an accessory to Richard's increasingly narcissistic abuse of power. In their bedroom, Victoria sat at her antique vanity and began removing her jewelry piece by piece. Each item had a story. The pearl necklace had been a wedding gift from her grandmother. The diamond bracelet was from their 10th anniversary. The emerald earrings were from the night Richard's company went public, making them both incredibly wealthy. But as she looked at these symbols of their shared success, Victoria realized something that would change everything. She had brought more than love to their marriage. She had brought capital, connections, and business acumen that had been instrumental in building the Blackwood empire. Yet somewhere along the way, her contributions had been forgotten, minimized, and ultimately dismissed entirely. The realization didn't come as a shock. It came as a quiet, cold certainty that settled in her chest like winter morning air. Richard had just shown her exactly what he thought of their partnership, their marriage, and her worth as both a business partner and a human being. Victoria opened the antique jewelry box that had belonged to her mother and pulled out a small key she hadn't used in years. It was the key to their private safe, where the most important documents of their marriage and business partnership were stored. Documents that Richard assumed were safely locked away from prying eyes. Documents that might reveal just how much power Victoria actually possessed. As she prepared for bed, Victoria's mind was already working through possibilities. Richard thought he held all the cards in their relationship. He controlled the day-to-day operations of their business. He made the major financial decisions. He networked with investors and politicians who could make or break their empire. But Victoria knew something Richard had forgotten in his arrogance. She knew exactly how their partnership had been structured in those early days when Richard was desperate for capital and connections. She knew who had really funded the initial expansion that turned a small tech startup into a multi-million-dollar corporation. And most importantly, she knew that some mistakes could not be undone once they were made. Richard's physical push had been more than an act of disrespect. It had been a declaration of war. Victoria Blackwood had always been underestimated by her father, who thought women shouldn't be involved in serious business, by her professors at Columbia Business School, who assumed she was there to find a husband rather than build a career, by Richard himself, who had initially pursued her for her family's money and connections, but had gradually convinced himself that his own brilliance was responsible for their success. Tomorrow, Victoria would begin the process of reminding everyone exactly who they were dealing with. Tonight, she would plan her first moves in a game that Richard didn't even know had begun. The last thing Victoria did before turning off the lights was to look at herself one more time in the vanity mirror. The woman staring back at her looked different than she had just hours earlier. There was something new in her eyes, something that had been dormant for years but was now fully awake. It was the look of a woman who had just remembered her own power. The next morning found Victoria in her pristine kitchen at 6 a.m., exactly 3 hours before Richard typically emerged from their bedroom. The coffee machine hummed quietly as she spread financial documents across the granite island that served as the heart of their domestic life. Morning news played softly in the background, but Victoria's attention was focused entirely on the papers before her. These weren't the quarterly reports she had tried to discuss with Richard the night before. These were older documents, pulled from their private safe before dawn while Richard slept off his whiskey-fueled investor meeting. Documents that told the real story of how Blackwood Industries had been built. Mrs. Blackwood Sarah Chen, Victoria's 28-year-old assistant, appeared in the kitchen doorway carrying a leather portfolio. "I brought the quarterly reports you requested, along with the research on the Henderson acquisition." Sarah had been working for Victoria for 3 years, initially hired to manage Victoria's extensive charity work and social obligations. But Victoria had quickly discovered that the young woman had a sharp mind for business and an even sharper eye for detail. "Sarah, in all your research into our financial structure, have you ever looked closely at the actual ownership documents for Blackwood Industries?" Sarah set down her portfolio and poured herself a cup of coffee from the machine. "Well, I always assumed it was a 50-50 partnership between you and Mr. Blackwood. That's what all the business publications report." Victoria smiled for the first time since the previous evening. That's what everyone assumes, including my dear husband. She pulled out a manila folder from the safe documents and opened it to reveal a signature page from 1998. The paper was slightly yellowed with age, but the legal language was crystal clear. Sarah, what do you see when you look at this ownership structure? Sarah studied the document carefully, her expression changing as she read through the legal terminology. Mrs. Blackwood, this shows you as the majority shareholder. 51% of Blackwood Industries. My father always told me never to give up complete control, even in marriage. Especially in marriage, actually. Richard was so desperate for my family's investment capital back then. He would have signed anything I put in front of him. Victoria remembered those early days with perfect clarity. Richard had been brilliant but broke, a tech entrepreneur with revolutionary ideas but no money to implement them. Victoria had been fresh out of Columbia with her MBA, armed with a trust fund from her father's manufacturing empire and connections throughout New York's financial community. The marriage had been passionate and pragmatic in equal measure. Richard got the funding and legitimacy he needed to build his company. Victoria got a partnership with someone whose vision matched her own ambition. It had been the perfect arrangement for two people who understood that love and business success were not mutually exclusive. But somewhere in the intervening years, as their wealth grew and their social status climbed, Richard had begun to rewrite their history. In his version of events, he was the visionary genius who had built an empire through his own brilliance. Victoria became the supportive wife who had provided some early financial assistance. Mrs. Blackwood, Sarah said carefully, if you control 51% of the company, then technically you have final approval authority over all major decisions, including acquisitions that could cost us millions of dollars. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text message from Richard. Playing golf with Henderson and his team today? We'll discuss final details. Don't wait up. The casual dismissiveness of the message was exactly what Victoria had come to expect. Richard conducting major business negotiations without consulting her had become routine. Her input was no longer requested or apparently needed. But looking at the ownership documents spread across her kitchen island, Victoria realized that Richard's confidence was built on a fundamental misunderstanding of their legal relationship. He had been making decisions for years as if he controlled the company, when in reality, Victoria could override any decision he made. Sarah, I want you to do something for me. Very quietly, I want you to research the Henderson acquisition from a different angle. Instead of looking at why it might be profitable, I want you to look at what could go wrong. What kind of problems should I look for? Everything. Environmental issues, labor disputes, regulatory problems, hidden debts. If this deal has any skeletons in its closet, I want to know about them before Richard signs anything. As Sarah left to begin her research, Victoria found herself thinking about the moment when she had first fallen in love with Richard Blackwood. It had been at a tech conference in Silicon Valley. She was there representing her father's investment firm, looking for emerging companies that might be worth backing. Richard had been presenting his vision for what would eventually become their flagship software platform. He had been magnetic on stage, confident without being arrogant, visionary without being unrealistic. After his presentation, Victoria had approached him with what she thought was a straightforward business proposition. Her family's money in exchange for a significant ownership stake in his company. Richard had been intrigued by more than just her investment offer. Their first dinner meeting had lasted until 3 a.m. as they discussed business strategy, technology trends, and their shared belief that the internet would fundamentally change how people worked and lived. 6 months later, they were married. 12 months after that, Blackwood Industries was incorporated with Victoria as the majority shareholder and Richard as the chief executive officer. It had been the perfect partnership between vision and capital, ambition and pragmatism. But successful partnerships require mutual respect and ongoing communication. And respect, Victoria was learning, was something that could erode so gradually that you didn't notice it was gone until someone pushed you out of your own business meeting. The irony was not lost on her. Richard thought he was protecting his empire from outside threats. conducting secretive negotiations to maintain his competitive advantage. He had no idea that the biggest threat to his control was sitting in their kitchen, drinking coffee and reviewing documents that proved she had never given up the power to stop him. Victoria's internal monologue began to shift into something she hadn't felt in years. How many women have felt invisible in their own homes? She wondered. How many of us have been pushed aside, literally or figuratively, while the men in our lives make decisions about our future? How many of us have forgotten that we once had power, only to rediscover it in moments of crisis? The awakening was not dramatic. It was quiet and methodical, like dawn breaking over the Connecticut hills outside their kitchen windows. But it was irreversible. Victoria Blackwood was remembering who she had been before she became Richard's wife. She was remembering the woman who had negotiated million-dollar deals before her 25th birthday. That woman was about to make her return. Victoria met her longtime friend Margaret Chen at Le Bernardin 3 days later, settling into their usual corner table where Manhattan's elite conducted their most sensitive conversations. The restaurant's discreet atmosphere and exceptional service made it perfect for discussions that required both privacy and legitimacy. Margaret had been Victoria's classmate at Columbia Business School, one of the few women in their MBA program who had gone on to build a powerhouse career in mergers and acquisitions. Over the past 30 years, she had orchestrated some of the decade's most complex corporate takeovers, earning a reputation for finding opportunities that others missed and executing deals that others considered impossible. "Victoria, darling, you look like a woman with a plan," Margaret said as she settled into her chair, her designer suit impeccable despite having flown in from Hong Kong that morning. "Should I be worried for Richard?" "Margaret, you've been handling high-stakes divorces and business separations for 3 decades. If someone wanted to quietly investigate their spouse's business dealings, hypothetically speaking, where would they start?" Margaret's laugh was knowing and slightly predatory. "Hypothetically, I would start with the accounting firm. Forensic accountants can find money trails that would make bloodhounds jealous. They specialize in discovering assets that people think they've hidden successfully." Victoria had known this conversation was necessary, but she had not expected it to feel so liberating. For the first time in years, she was discussing business strategy with someone who treated her as an equal rather than an accessory. "But before we get to forensic accounting," Margaret continued, "you need to understand that investigating a spouse's business activities is not just about finding hidden assets. It's about understanding the full scope of their financial exposure, what debts they might have hidden, what legal liabilities they might be carrying, what regulatory problems they might be facing." The waiter appeared to take their lunch order, providing a natural pause in their conversation. Victoria ordered the sea bass, exactly what she always ordered at Le Bernardin. But today, even familiar routines felt different. Today, she was not here as Richard Blackwood's wife making social conversation. She was here as a business owner protecting her interests. "Margaret, there are rumors about Richard's recent expansion into overseas markets. Word is he's been moving money through shell companies to minimize tax exposure." "Shell companies?" Victoria tried to keep her voice casual, but Margaret's expression told her that her friend had picked up on the underlying concern. "Paper businesses that exist primarily to move money between jurisdictions. They can be completely legal if properly structured and documented, but they can also be used to hide assets from tax authorities, creditors, or divorce settlements." Victoria felt something cold settle in her stomach. And if someone were to expose improperly structured shell companies to the appropriate authorities, well, hypothetically, it could trigger investigations that might freeze assets pending resolution. Depending on what investigators found, it could result in criminal charges for tax evasion, money laundering, or fraud. Margaret set down her wine glass and leaned forward slightly. "Victoria, I've known you for over 20 years. We've been through business school together, celebrated each other's successes, and supported each other through every major life transition. So I'm going to ask you directly, are you planning to divorce Richard?" The question hung in the air between them like an undetonated bomb. Victoria had been thinking about divorce for months, but she had not yet said the word out loud to anyone. including herself. "I'm planning to protect myself," Victoria said finally. "Richard has been making increasingly risky business decisions without consulting me. Last night, he physically pushed me out of a business meeting in our own home. I need to understand exactly what I might be liable for if his risk-taking goes wrong. And if you discover that he's been hiding assets or engaging in questionable financial practices, then I need to decide whether I want to be married to someone who could potentially face federal charges." Margaret nodded slowly. "Victoria, I'm going to give you the name of someone who specializes in exactly this type of situation. James Morrison is a private investigator who works exclusively with high-net-worth individuals facing complex marital and business disputes. He's expensive, but he's discreet and thorough." She wrote a phone number on her business card and slid it across the table. "Tell him I referred you. He'll understand exactly what kind of investigation you need." As they finished their lunch, Margaret shared stories about other women who had faced similar situations. Wives who had discovered that their husband's business success was built on increasingly fragile foundations. Women who had been forced to choose between their financial security and their personal safety. "The most important thing to remember," Margaret said as they prepared to leave, "is that knowledge is power. The more you understand about Richard's actual financial situation, the better position you'll be to protect yourself, regardless of what you ultimately decide to do about your marriage." Victoria walked back to her car, feeling something she had not experienced in years. For the first time since Richard had pushed her out of his study, she felt like she was taking action rather than simply reacting to his behavior. But as she drove home to their Connecticut estate, Victoria also felt the weight of what she was contemplating. Investigating your own husband's business practices was not something you could undo. Once she opened this door, there would be no going back to the comfortable ignorance that had characterized the past several years of their marriage. Still, as she pulled into their circular driveway and looked up at the mansion they had built together, Victoria knew she was making the right choice. Richard had shown her exactly what he thought of their partnership. Now it was time for her to remember exactly what she was capable of when she stopped asking for permission and started taking control. The woman who had negotiated her first $1 million deal at 24 was still there. Underneath years of playing the role of the supportive wife, it was time to let her out. James Morrison's office occupied the 32nd floor of a gleaming Manhattan high-rise, with windows overlooking Central Park and walls lined with certificates that spoke to his expertise in financial crimes investigation. The space smelled like coffee and determination, with the quiet efficiency of someone who specialized in uncovering secrets that powerful people preferred to keep hidden. "Mrs. Blackwood," James said as he gestured for Victoria to take a seat across from his mahogany desk. "Margaret Chen told me you might need my particular expertise." James Morrison looked exactly like what Victoria had expected from a private investigator who worked exclusively with Manhattan's wealthy elite. Mid-50s, immaculately dressed, with the kind of calm confidence that came from 20 years of investigating people who thought they were too smart to get caught. "Mr. Morrison, I need to understand the full scope of my husband's business activities, particularly his recent expansion into international markets. Mrs. Blackwood, before we begin, I want you to understand exactly what this type of investigation entails. I don't just look at bank statements and business filings. I trace money through complex networks of shell companies, offshore accounts, and international transactions. Sometimes what I find can be problematic." Victoria had spent the 3 days since her lunch with Margaret preparing herself mentally for this conversation. She had reviewed every financial document she could access legally, spoken with their family attorney about hypothetical scenarios, and researched the potential consequences of various types of financial irregularities. "I understand the risks, Mr. Morrison. I need to know what those risks actually are." James opened a leather portfolio and began spreading documents across his desk. "I've already done some preliminary research based on publicly available information about Blackwood Industries. What I've found is going to surprise you." Victoria felt her heart rate increase slightly, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm listening." "Your husband has been moving money through 7 different offshore accounts over the past 18 months. Luxembourg, Cayman Islands, British Virgin Islands, and several others. But here's the interesting part. He's been doing it under both your names. The room seemed to tilt slightly as Victoria processed this information. Both our names, Mrs. Blackwood, according to the banking records I've been able to access, you have been listed as a co-signatory on international transfer documents for the past 5 years. Documents that show your electronic signature authorizing transfers of significant amounts of money to offshore accounts. Victoria's mouth went dry. Mr. Morrison, I have never signed any international transfer documents. I don't even know the account numbers for our offshore holdings. That's what I was afraid you might say. James pulled out a manila folder containing photocopies of banking documents. Each page showed Victoria's signature, apparently authorizing transfers of hundreds of thousands of dollars to accounts she had never heard of. Mrs. Blackwood, if these signatures are forged and based on your reaction, I believe they are then your husband has been committing federal crimes that could implicate you as either a co-conspirator or a victim. Victoria studied the documents, recognizing her signature style, but knowing with absolute certainty that she had never seen these papers before. The implications were staggering. How much money are we talking about? Current estimate based on the transfers I've been able to trace. Approximately $57 million moved without your knowledge or consent. The number hit Victoria like a physical blow. $57 million represented a significant portion of their joint net worth. Money that Richard had been moving systematically while maintaining the pretense of consulting her on major financial decisions. There's more, Mrs. Blackwood. The Henderson acquisition that your husband is currently pursuing, he's planning to fund it primarily with money from these offshore accounts. Money that has been moved through questionable channels using forged authorization documents. Victoria's phone buzzed with an incoming call. Richard's name appeared on the screen. Mr. Morrison, would it be possible to record this conversation? In New York, only one party needs to consent to recording. If you answer that call, you can legally record whatever your husband says to you. Victoria activated her phone's recording feature and answered the call. Hello, Richard. Victoria, I need you to sign some transfer documents when I get home tonight. Just routine paperwork to finalize the Henderson funding structure. Victoria looked directly at James Morrison as she responded. What kind of transfers? Richard, nothing you need to worry about, sweetheart. International currency hedging, tax optimization strategies, technical stuff that would bore you. Just trust me. The casual condescension in Richard's voice was infuriating, but Victoria kept her tone neutral. I'll take a look at the documents when you get home. You don't need to read through all the details. Just sign where I've marked the signature lines. We need to move quickly on this. After Richard hung up, Victoria sat in James Morrison's office trying to process the magnitude of what she had discovered. Her husband had been systematically stealing from their joint assets while simultaneously setting her up to take legal responsibility for his crimes. Mrs. Blackwood, based on what I've found so far, you have two choices. You can confront your husband directly and hope he voluntarily corrects the situation, or you can work with federal authorities to document the full scope of his activities before he has a chance to hide additional evidence. Victoria thought about the woman she had been 25 years ago. That woman would not have hesitated. She would have gathered every piece of evidence, consulted with the best attorneys, and methodically built a case that would protect her interests while holding Richard accountable for his actions. Mr. Morrison, I want you to document everything. Every forged signature, every questionable transfer, every piece of evidence that shows Richard has been operating without my knowledge or consent. And I want you to do it quickly, before he realizes what I've discovered. That's going to require working with federal investigators. The kind of documentation we need to prove forgery and unauthorized transfers requires forensic analysis that only law enforcement agencies can provide. Victoria felt the same cold certainty she had experienced the night Richard pushed her out of his study. Some decisions could not be unmade once they were implemented, but some situations required decisive action, regardless of the personal cost. Do whatever is necessary, Mr. Morrison. Richard has made his choice about how he wants to treat our partnership. Now I'm making mine. As Victoria left James Morrison's office, She realized that she had just crossed a line that would fundamentally change her life. She was no longer just investigating her husband's business practices. She was building a case that could potentially send him to federal prison. But as she thought about the $57 million he had stolen and the forged documents that could have implicated her in his crimes, Victoria felt no regret. Richard had been planning her destruction while pretending to love her. Now it was time for him to discover what happened when you underestimated Victoria Blackwood. Victoria spent the next morning at her favorite day spa, needing the familiar routine of massage and meditation to process everything James Morrison had revealed. But even in the relaxation room, surrounded by soft music and the scent of lavender, she could not escape the reality of her situation. Her marriage was not just failing, it was potentially criminal. The spa had always been Victoria's refuge from the pressures of wealth and social obligations. Here, she was not Mrs. Richard Blackwood, wife of a tech industry titan. She was simply a woman trying to find peace in an increasingly complicated world. Mrs. Blackwood. The spa attendant's voice was soft and apologetic. There's an urgent call for you at the front desk. The caller said it was regarding a family emergency. Victoria's first thought was of her elderly mother, who lived in assisted living in Florida. But when she reached the front desk, the caller was James Morrison. Mrs. Blackwood, I need you to come to my office immediately. I've discovered something that changes everything we discussed yesterday. What kind of something? The kind that requires immediate action. I can't discuss it over the phone. Victoria left the spa without finishing her appointment, driving into Manhattan with a growing sense of dread. James Morrison's voice had carried an urgency that suggested her situation was even worse than she had imagined. When she arrived at his office, James was waiting with a woman Victoria didn't recognize. Tall, blonde, and expensively dressed. She looked like she belonged in Richard's social circle. Mrs. Blackwood, this is Amanda Richardson. She contacted me this morning after hearing through mutual acquaintances that I was investigating Blackwood Industries. Amanda stood to shake Victoria's hand, her grip firm and her expression serious. Mrs. Blackwood, I'm sorry to meet you under these circumstances, but I think you need to know that your husband and I have been having an affair for the past 18 months. The words hit Victoria like a physical blow, but she managed to remain standing. 23 years of marriage had prepared her for many possibilities, but she had never seriously considered that Richard might be unfaithful. I ended the relationship 6 weeks ago when I discovered that Richard had been using our connection to access my family's banking information. He's been using details about my trust fund to create fraudulent accounts that mirror my legitimate offshore holdings. Victoria sat down heavily in the chair across from James Morrison's desk. He's been using multiple women to create false financial identities. Mrs. Blackwood, James said gently, Amanda is not the only woman Richard has been involved with. Based on my investigation, he has been cultivating relationships with at least 3 wealthy women over the past 2 years. Women whose personal financial information he has been using to create an increasingly complex network of fraudulent accounts. Amanda opened her purse and pulled out a manila folder. These are copies of documents Richard asked me to sign. Investment agreements, banking authorizations, international transfer documents. I signed them because I trusted him, because I thought we were building a future together. Victoria studied the documents, recognizing the same format and language as the papers James had shown her the previous day. Richard had been running a systematic operation, using his charm and social connections to manipulate multiple women into providing access to their family wealth. How much money has he stolen from you? Victoria asked. Approximately $12 million from my trust fund, money that my grandmother left specifically for my children's education and my own retirement security. The scope of Richard's betrayal was becoming clear. He had not just been unfaithful to their marriage. He had been operating a sophisticated financial fraud scheme that victimized multiple women while using Victoria's name and reputation to legitimize his activities. Mrs. Blackwood, James said, there's something else you need to know. Richard has been planning to leave the country. Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. What do you mean? He's been liquidating assets and moving money to accounts in countries that don't have extradition treaties with the United States. Based on the travel documents I've uncovered, he's planning to disappear within the next 30 days. The realization hit Victoria with stunning clarity. Richard had not been building their empire. He had been systematically destroying it while positioning himself to escape the consequences. The Henderson acquisition was not a legitimate business expansion. It was his final theft before fleeing the country with as much money as he could steal. He's been planning this for years, Victoria said quietly. The shell companies, the forged signatures, the affair, it's all been preparation for abandoning everything and everyone. Amanda nodded. When I confronted him about the missing money from my trust fund, he told me that sometimes people get hurt in business, that I should consider it a learning experience about trusting the wrong person. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text message from Richard. Working late tonight. Don't wait up. Important developments with Henderson deal. The casual dismissiveness of the message now carried an entirely different meaning. Richard was not working late on legitimate business. He was finalizing his escape plan while maintaining the pretense of being a devoted husband. Mrs. Blackwood, James said, we need to move quickly. If Richard realizes that we've discovered his plans, he could accelerate his timeline and disappear before we can document the full scope of his crimes. Victoria thought about the 23 years she had spent building a life with someone who had been systematically betraying her trust. The shared dreams, the collaborative business decisions, the intimate moments that had formed the foundation of their partnership, all of it had been a lie. But underneath the betrayal and the shock, Victoria felt something else emerging. The same cold anger that had sustained her through business school when professors dismissed her contributions. The same determined focus that had driven her to build successful companies before she met Richard. Mr. Morrison, I want you to coordinate with federal authorities immediately. I want every account traced, every forged document authenticated, and every piece of evidence that proves Richard has been defrauding multiple victims. Mrs. Blackwood, Amanda said, I want you to know that I never intended to hurt your marriage. Richard told me that you were getting divorced, that the separation was amicable, and that you had agreed to divide assets equitably. Victoria looked at the younger woman with something approaching sympathy. Amanda had been a victim of Richard's manipulation, just as surely as Victoria had been. Amanda, neither of us is responsible for Richard's choices, but both of us are responsible for making sure he faces the consequences of those choices. As Victoria drove home to Connecticut that evening, she realized that her midlife transformation had accelerated beyond anything she could have imagined. 3 days ago, she had been a wealthy wife dealing with a dismissive husband. Now she was the primary witness in a federal investigation that would likely result in criminal charges against her millionaire ex-husband. The irony was not lost on her. Richard thought he was clever enough to steal millions of dollars and disappear before anyone discovered his crimes. He had no idea that the woman he had been dismissing for years was about to demonstrate exactly why underestimating Victoria Blackwood was the biggest mistake of his life. Victoria's divorce attorney, Patricia Wells, occupied a corner office in one of Manhattan's most prestigious law firms. With floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park and a reputation for protecting women's assets in some of the city's most complex marital dissolutions, Patricia had been recommended by Margaret Chen, who described her as someone who understood that high-stakes divorces were often more about financial warfare than emotional resolution. Victoria, what you've discovered is not just grounds for divorce, it's grounds for federal prosecution, Patricia said as she reviewed the documents that James Morrison had compiled. Your husband has been operating a sophisticated fraud scheme that victimizes multiple women while using your name and business reputation to legitimize his activities. Victoria sat across from Patricia's mahogany conference table, watching the attorney organize evidence with the precision of a military strategist. Bank statements, forged documents, recorded conversations, and witness statements from Amanda Richardson created a paper trail that painted a damning picture of Richard's criminal activities. Patricia, I want him to pay for every dollar he's stolen, every signature he's forged, and every lie he's told. But I also want to make sure that I'm protected from any criminal liability. That's exactly what we're going to do. But we need to be strategic about timing and coordination. If we move too quickly, Richard might accelerate his escape plans. If we move too slowly, he might succeed in leaving the country with assets that belong to his victims. Patricia spread a timeline across the conference table, showing Richard's financial activities over the past 3 years. The pattern was clear systematic theft disguised as legitimate business expansion, with each fraudulent transaction becoming larger and more brazen. The first thing we need to do is work with federal authorities to freeze the offshore accounts. I have contacts at the Treasury Department who can expedite this process, but we need to provide them with sufficient evidence to justify immediate action. Victoria studied the timeline, recognizing dates that corresponded to family vacations, business trips, and social events. Richard had been stealing from their joint assets while maintaining the pretense of sharing every aspect of their life together. What about the Henderson acquisition? That's where we set the trap, Patricia said with a slight smile. We're going to let Richard proceed with the deal, but we're going to ensure that federal investigators are monitoring every transaction. When he attempts to use stolen money to fund the acquisition, he'll be committing additional felonies in front of witnesses. Victoria felt something she had not experienced in years, the thrill of being truly in control of a complex strategic situation. So when he tries to close the Henderson deal, he'll be arrested for money laundering, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit tax evasion, and theft of marital assets. The beauty of this approach is that Richard will have documented his own crimes through his legitimate business activities. Patricia's assistant entered the conference room carrying additional files and a pot of coffee. Victoria recognized the young woman as someone who had handled several high-profile divorce cases that had made headlines in the business press. Mrs. Blackwood, the assistant said, we've received preliminary responses from the federal investigators. They're requesting a meeting tomorrow morning to discuss your cooperation in building their case against your husband. Victoria poured herself a cup of coffee and considered the magnitude of what she was agreeing to undertake. Cooperating with federal investigators meant that her marriage was not just ending, it was becoming the centerpiece of a criminal prosecution that would likely attract significant media attention. Patricia, what are the potential consequences for Richard if he's convicted on all charges, conservatively 7 to 10 years in federal prison, plus complete forfeiture of assets obtained through criminal activity? The prosecution will argue that his entire business expansion over the past 3 years was funded through fraud, which could result in seizure of properties, investments, and business interests worth over $100 million. The number was staggering. Richard had been so focused on stealing millions that he had put their entire fortune at risk. If federal prosecutors could prove that their business success was built on criminal activity, Victoria could lose everything they had built together. But there's good news, and Patricia continued. Because you've been cooperative from the beginning, and because we can demonstrate that you were a victim rather than a co-conspirator, you'll likely be able to retain assets that can be proven to have legitimate origins. Patricia pulled out a legal document that she had been drafting while Victoria met with federal investigators. This is a petition for legal separation based on fraud and criminal activity. It immediately protects you from liability for Richard's future actions while preserving your rights to legitimate marital assets. Victoria read through the document carefully, recognizing legal language that would fundamentally change her relationship with Richard. Once she signed these papers, there would be no possibility of reconciliation or returning to their previous life. There's one more thing we need to discuss, Patricia said. Richard is going to realize eventually that his activities are being investigated. When that happens, he's likely to become desperate and potentially dangerous. I'm recommending that you consider hiring personal security and potentially relocating temporarily until he's been arrested. Victoria thought about the man she had been married to for 23 years. Richard could be arrogant and dismissive, but she had never considered him physically dangerous. But people facing federal prison sentences sometimes made choices they would never have considered under normal circumstances. How long do we have before Richard realizes what's happening? Based on the federal investigators' timeline, probably less than a week. They want to coordinate the asset freezes with his arrest to minimize the possibility that he'll flee the country. Victoria signed the legal separation documents with a steady hand, watching her signature authorize the end of her marriage and the beginning of Richard's prosecution. The woman who had signed these papers was not the same person who had been pushed out of Richard's study just 1 week earlier. That woman had been uncertain, dismissed, and gradually disappearing under years of narcissistic abuse and financial manipulation. This woman was someone Victoria remembered from her early career, decisive, strategic, and absolutely committed to protecting her interests regardless of the personal cost. Patricia, I want you to coordinate closely with the federal prosecutors. I want to make sure that Richard faces consequences, not just for what he's done to me, but for what he's done to Amanda Richardson and every other woman he's victimized. As Victoria left Patricia's office that evening, she realized that her midlife transformation was accelerating into something she had never anticipated. She was not just ending her marriage, she was dismantling a criminal enterprise that her husband had built using her name and reputation. The woman who walked out of that law firm was someone Richard Blackwood had never met. Someone he had been too arrogant and self-absorbed to recognize was emerging from years of being underestimated and dismissed. Tomorrow, that woman would begin the final phase of ensuring that Richard's betrayal became the foundation of his destruction. The Henderson acquisition dinner was held at the Four Seasons, in the private dining room where Manhattan's elite conducted business deals that would reshape entire industries. Victoria arrived separately from Richard, playing the role of the supportive wife attending an important business function while knowing that she was actually serving as an undercover witness for federal investigators. James Morrison had briefed her extensively on what to expect. Federal agents would be monitoring the restaurant's communication systems, recording every conversation that took place during the dinner. Victoria's role was to encourage Richard to speak openly about the funding sources for the Henderson deal, providing prosecutors with additional evidence of his criminal activities. "Victoria, darling, you look absolutely stunning tonight," Richard said as she joined the group at their reserved table. He kissed her cheek with the casual affection of someone who had no idea that his wife had spent the past week building a federal case against him. Victoria had chosen her outfit carefully, the red dress Richard had bought her for their 10th anniversary, paired with the diamond necklace he had given her when Blackwood Industries went public. She wanted to look like the perfect corporate wife while knowing that this would be the last time she would ever play that role. "Mr. Henderson, Mrs. Henderson, it's wonderful to see you again," Victoria said as she took her seat beside Richard. The Henderson family controlled a manufacturing empire that would complement Blackwood Industries' technology platforms, creating a vertically integrated operation worth over $500 million. "Richard has been so excited about this partnership," Victoria continued. "Haven't you? Darling, he's been working such long hours to make sure every detail is perfect." Richard smiled with the confidence of someone who believed he was about to close the deal of a lifetime. "The synergies between our companies are remarkable. When we combine Henderson's manufacturing capabilities with our software platforms, we'll be able to dominate markets across 3 continents. Mr. Henderson, a cautious businessman in his 70s, had built his empire through careful analysis and conservative decision-making. Richard, your enthusiasm is infectious, but I want to make sure we're being realistic about the financial requirements. This kind of expansion requires significant capital investment." "Absolutely," Richard replied. "That's why I've been working so carefully to structure our funding sources. We're using a combination of traditional bank financing and international investment capital to minimize risk while maximizing growth potential." Victoria felt her heart rate increase slightly as Richard began discussing the funding structure that she knew was built on stolen assets and forged documents. Every word he spoke was being recorded by federal investigators who would use his own statements to prosecute him. "International investment capital," Mrs. Henderson asked. "That sounds intriguing. Are you working with European investors, or are you looking at opportunities in Asia?" "Both, actually," Richard said, warming to his subject. "We've been able to access offshore funding sources that provide excellent tax advantages while maintaining full regulatory compliance." Victoria knew that Richard's confidence was based on his belief that she remained ignorant of his criminal activities. He had no idea that the woman sitting beside him had spent the past week documenting every aspect of his fraud scheme. Richard, Victoria said sweetly, perhaps you should explain to our friends exactly how you've structured these offshore arrangements. I'm sure they would appreciate understanding the full scope of your financial planning. Richard's smile faltered almost imperceptibly as he looked at Victoria. For just a moment, she saw something flicker in his eyes, a brief uncertainty about whether her questions were innocent or calculated. Well, the technical details would probably bore everyone, Richard said carefully. The important thing is that we have access to the capital we need to make this partnership successful. Mr. Henderson set down his wine glass and leaned forward slightly. Richard, I appreciate your confidence, but Henderson Industries has been successful for 50 years because we insist on transparency in all our business relationships. If we're going to merge our operations, I need to understand exactly where your funding originates. Victoria watched Richard's face as he realized that his vague explanations were not going to satisfy potential partners who had their own legal and financial advisors reviewing every aspect of the proposed deal. Of course, Richard said, his voice carrying a slight edge of stress. The funding comes from a diversified portfolio of international investments, properly managed through our offshore growth strategy to optimize tax efficiency while maintaining full compliance with all applicable regulations. Offshore growth strategy, Victoria asked, her voice carrying the same sweet tone she had used throughout their marriage when asking about business decisions. Could you be more specific about which jurisdictions you're using? I'm sure our friends would be interested in the sophisticated international planning you've developed. The room went quiet as everyone at the table recognized that Victoria was asking pointed questions about financial arrangements that Richard clearly preferred to keep vague. Mrs. Henderson glanced at her husband with the expression of someone who had attended enough business dinners to recognize when negotiations were taking an unexpected turn. Victoria, Richard said, his voice tightening, these are complex financial instruments that involve proprietary strategies. Perhaps we should focus on the operational synergies that make this partnership so exciting. But Victoria was not finished. She had spent 23 years being dismissed and excluded from important business discussions. Tonight, she was going to use Richard's own arrogance against him. I think our friends deserve to know that the money you're using to fund this acquisition has been moved through 7 different offshore accounts without the knowledge or consent of your business partners, Victoria said, her voice remaining perfectly calm and professional. The table went completely silent. Mr. Henderson's face showed the expression of someone who had just realized that the business deal he was considering might be far more complicated than he had understood. Victoria, Richard hissed, you don't know what you're talking about. I know exactly what I'm talking about. Richard, I also know that federal investigators are currently reviewing our accounts based on evidence I provided documenting systematic fraud and forgery spanning the past 3 years. Richard's face went white as he realized that Victoria was not asking innocent questions. She was systematically destroying his credibility in front of the very people he needed to trust him with hundreds of millions of dollars. The woman who had been pushed out of his study 1 week earlier was gone. In her place sat someone Richard had never encountered before, someone who understood exactly how to destroy him, using his own words and his own overconfidence. The restaurant erupted in controlled chaos as the business associates processed Victoria's devastating revelation. Mr. Henderson immediately excused himself to make urgent phone calls to his attorneys, while other potential investors began whispered conversations that Richard could hear but not control. What the hell do you think you're doing? Richard demanded, grabbing Victoria's arm as she stood to collect her purse. Victoria pulled away from his grip with the calm confidence of someone who had anticipated this moment for days. I'm taking back control of my life, Richard. Something I should have done years ago. You'll destroy everything we've built together. Everything you've stolen. You mean, there's a significant difference. Richard's face was flushed red with rage and panic as he realized that his carefully planned acquisition was collapsing in real time. Victoria, you don't understand the consequences of what you're doing. These business relationships took years to develop. The only consequence I care about is making sure you face accountability for stealing $57 million from our joint assets while setting me up to take legal responsibility for your crimes. As if summoned by Victoria's words, Two individuals approached their table with the purposeful stride of people who were accustomed to making arrests in high-end establishments. Victoria recognized Agent Sarah Coleman from their coordination meeting earlier that week. Mr. Richard Blackwood. Agent Coleman's voice carried the authority of someone who had been investigating financial crimes for over a decade. Yes. Richard's voice was shaking slightly as he looked between the federal agents and Victoria's calm expression. You're under arrest for money laundering, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit tax evasion, and theft of marital assets. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The sound of handcuffs clicking into place seemed unnaturally loud in the suddenly quiet restaurant. Other diners had stopped their conversations to stare at the scene unfolding in the private dining room, where Manhattan's elite usually conducted their most discreet business. Victoria, Richard said as Agent Coleman began leading him toward the restaurant's exit. You have no idea what you've just done to our life. Victoria looked at her husband of 23 years as he was led away in handcuffs, his face a mixture of rage, disbelief, and dawning comprehension that his carefully constructed empire was collapsing. Richard, I know exactly what I've done. I've stopped you from destroying more lives while protecting myself from the consequences of your criminal behavior. Mr. Henderson approached Victoria as the federal agents left with Richard. Mrs. Blackwood, I want you to know that Henderson Industries will be conducting our own comprehensive investigation. If what you've told us tonight is accurate, it's all documented. Mr. Henderson, every forged signature, every unauthorized transfer, every fraudulent account, the federal investigators have been building their case for weeks. Victoria walked out of the Four Seasons into the cool Manhattan evening, feeling something she had not experienced since her early career, the satisfaction of executing a complex strategic plan with precision and devastating effectiveness. Her phone buzzed with text messages from friends and business associates who had already heard news of Richard's arrest. Word traveled quickly through Manhattan's financial community, and Victoria knew that by morning, the story would be front-page news in the business press. But as she stood on the sidewalk outside the restaurant where her marriage had effectively ended, Victoria felt remarkably calm. The woman who had been pushed out of Richard's study just 8 days earlier had been uncertain and gradually disappearing under years of dismissive treatment. This woman was someone Victoria recognized from her past decisive, strategic, and absolutely committed to protecting her interests regardless of the personal cost. The woman who had negotiated her first major business deal at 24 years old. Victoria's phone rang with a call from Patricia Wells. Victoria, I'm watching the news coverage of Richard's arrest. Are you okay? I'm perfect. Patricia, better than I've been in years. The federal prosecutors want to meet tomorrow to discuss your testimony for Richard's trial. Are you prepared for what that's going to involve? Victoria looked back at the Four Seasons, where Richard had planned to close the deal that would have completed his theft of their joint assets and funded his escape from the country. Patricia, I've been preparing for this my entire career. Richard made the mistake of thinking that 23 years of marriage had made me weak. He's about to discover exactly how wrong he was. As Victoria walked toward her car, she realized that her midlife transformation was complete. She was no longer Richard Blackwood's wife, struggling to maintain relevance in her own marriage. She was Victoria Blackwood, majority owner of a multi-million-dollar corporation and the primary witness in a federal prosecution that would likely result in her millionaire ex-husband spending the next decade in prison. The woman who had felt invisible just 1 week earlier had just demonstrated to Manhattan's business elite exactly what happened when you underestimated Victoria Blackwood. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of rebuilding her life and her business empire. Tonight, she would celebrate the fact that she had remembered her own power just in time to save herself from destruction. 3 weeks after Richard's arrest, Victoria sat in her home office, formerly Richard's private study, reviewing documents that would reshape her life and business empire. The mahogany-paneled room that had once symbolized her exclusion from important decisions now served as the command center for her financial independence and corporate control. The irony was not lost on her. The room where Richard had pushed her out of a business meeting had become the place where she orchestrated his complete downfall and her own resurrection as a formidable business leader. "Victoria," Patricia Wells said through the speakerphone on Victoria's desk. "The final accounting is remarkable. Between the recovered offshore funds, the frozen assets, and the criminal restitution order, you're looking at approximately $83 million returned to your personal accounts." Victoria studied the financial statements spread across her desk, numbers that represented not just money, but vindication of every strategic decision she had made over the past month. The federal investigation had uncovered additional criminal activity that even James Morrison's thorough investigation had missed. What's Richard's current situation? His attorneys are negotiating a plea bargain that would involve 7 to 10 years in federal prison. The prosecution has been clear that the plea agreement would include complete forfeiture of all claims to Blackwood Industries and any assets that can be traced to his criminal activities. Victoria hung up the phone and walked to the window overlooking their Connecticut estate. At 51 years old, she was wealthier than she had ever imagined possible, completely free from a marriage that had become increasingly toxic, and positioned to rebuild her business empire according to her own vision, rather than Richard's increasingly reckless ambitions. The doorbell rang, and Victoria heard Sarah's voice greeting someone at the front entrance. A few moments later, her assistant appeared in the study doorway, carrying an envelope marked with the logo of Richard's legal team. "Mrs. Blackwood, this was delivered by courier. The attorney said it required your immediate attention." Victoria opened the envelope to find divorce papers that had already been signed by Richard's attorney on his behalf. The document was accompanied by a brief note in Richard's handwriting. "Victoria, you've destroyed everything we built together. I hope you're satisfied with what you've accomplished." Victoria read the note twice, then set it aside with something approaching amusement. Even facing federal prison, Richard remained convinced that he was the victim of Victoria's unreasonable behavior, rather than the architect of his own destruction through systematic criminal activity. "Sarah, please call Patricia Wells and let her know that Richard has expedited the divorce proceedings. Also, schedule a meeting with the board of directors for next week. It's time to discuss the future leadership structure of Blackwood Industries." As Sarah left to make the calls, Victoria realized that she was experiencing something she had not felt in decades: complete control over her own destiny. For 23 years, her life had been shaped by Richard's decisions, his ambitions, his vision of their shared future. Now, for the first time since their early marriage, Victoria was free to pursue her own goals without compromise or consultation. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Margaret Chen. "Saw the news coverage of Richard's plea negotiations. Are you ready to discuss what comes next for your career?" Victoria smiled as she typed her response. "More than ready. Let's talk about building something that Richard never could have imagined." The federal prosecutors had estimated that Richard's trial would begin within 6 months. Assuming he rejected the plea agreement currently being negotiated, Victoria would be the prosecution's primary witness, testifying about the forged signatures, unauthorized transfers, and systematic deception that had characterized the final years of their marriage. But testifying against Richard would not be difficult. Victoria had moved beyond anger into something more powerful: absolute clarity about who Richard actually was, beneath the charm and business success that had initially attracted her. He was someone who viewed other people as resources to be exploited, rather than partners to be respected. Victoria's phone rang with a call from Amanda Richardson, the other woman who had been victimized by Richard's financial fraud scheme. "Victoria, I wanted to thank you for having the courage to expose Richard's criminal activities. If you hadn't acted when you did, he would have succeeded in disappearing with millions of dollars that belonged to his victims." "Amanda, you don't need to thank me. I was protecting my own interests. The fact that it helped other people was simply a beneficial side effect. The federal prosecutors told me that Richard had been planning to leave the country within 2 weeks of when you initiated the investigation. You literally prevented him from escaping justice." After Amanda hung up, Victoria realized that her midlife transformation had accomplished something she had never anticipated. She had not just ended her marriage and recovered stolen assets. She had prevented Richard from destroying additional lives while building a criminal empire that could have operated for years before being discovered. The woman who had felt invisible in her own home just 1 month earlier had become the central figure in dismantling a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme that victimized women across Manhattan's social elite. Victoria opened her laptop and began drafting an email to the board of directors, announcing her intention to assume active leadership of Blackwood Industries. As the majority shareholder, she had always possessed the authority to make this decision. She had simply allowed Richard to convince her that her role should be advisory rather than executive. Tomorrow, she would begin implementing changes that would transform their technology company into something more aligned with her own values and vision. The first initiative would be a comprehensive audit of all business practices to ensure that no traces of Richard's criminal activities remain embedded in their corporate structure. The second initiative would be more personal. Victoria had decided to establish a foundation focused on helping women recognize and escape from situations involving financial abuse and narcissistic manipulation. Women like herself, who had gradually surrendered their own agency to partners who viewed them as accessories rather than equals. The foundation would provide legal assistance, financial counseling, and investigative services to women who suspected that their spouses or partners were engaged in financial crimes that could implicate them as unwitting co-conspirators. Victoria looked around the study that had once represented her exclusion from important decisions and now symbolized her complete control over her own destiny. In just 4 weeks, she had evolved from a dismissed wife into the primary witness in a federal prosecution, from a silent partner into the majority owner of a major corporation. The transformation had been painful but necessary, and it was far from complete. 6 months later, Victoria met Margaret Chen at their new favorite spot, a small cafe in Brooklyn that donated its profits to women's shelters and had become a symbol of how successful women could use their resources to create positive change in their communities. "Victoria, you look like a completely different person," Margaret said as she settled into her chair across from the small table near the cafe's front windows. "Have I mentioned how proud I am of what you've accomplished?" Victoria smiled as she sipped her coffee, watching the morning rush of Brooklyn commuters hurrying to catch trains that would carry them into Manhattan's financial district. Each person represented a story, a struggle, and choices between accepting what life offered them and fighting for what they truly deserved. "Margaret, you know what the strangest part of this entire experience has been for 23 years. I thought I needed Richard's approval to make important decisions. It turns out the most important decision I ever made was learning to trust my own judgment. And the Blackwood Foundation for Women's Financial Independence. We officially open our first office next month. We've already received over 200 inquiries from women who suspect their spouses or partners are engaged in financial activities that could implicate them in criminal behavior." Victoria had spent the past 6 months working with attorneys, financial advisors, and federal investigators to create something meaningful from her experience with Richard's betrayal. The foundation would provide free legal consultation, forensic accounting services, and investigative support to women facing situations similar to her own. "The most rewarding part," Victoria continued, "is working with women who are just beginning to recognize that their financial security has been compromised by someone they trusted. Yesterday, I met with a woman whose husband had been forging her signature on business loan documents for 3 years. Margaret nodded knowingly. Financial abuse is much more common than most people realize. The problem is that women often don't recognize it until the legal consequences become unavoidable. Victoria thought about her own experience of gradually surrendering financial control to Richard over the years of their marriage. The process had been so subtle that she had not recognized it as abuse until she discovered the forged signatures and unauthorized transfers that could have resulted in her facing federal charges as a co-conspirator. The Foundation's first major case involves a situation that's remarkably similar to what Richard was doing to me, Victoria said. A woman in Manhattan whose millionaire ex-husband had been using shell companies to hide assets during their divorce proceedings. Ikdani, how is Richard adjusting to federal prison? Victoria's expression showed neither satisfaction nor sympathy. According to his attorneys, he's maintaining his innocence and blaming me for destroying our marriage and his business reputation. Apparently, he's convinced his fellow inmates that he's the victim of a vindictive wife who couldn't appreciate his business genius. Even in prison, he's still engaging in narcissistic abuse patterns, which is exactly why the Foundation's work is so important. Richard genuinely believes that he was entitled to steal from our joint assets because he viewed himself as the superior business partner. That kind of thinking doesn't change just because someone faces legal consequences. Victoria's phone buzzed with a message from Sarah, who now served as the Foundation's executive director, in addition to her role as Victoria's personal assistant. The Forbes reporter is here for your interview about women's financial independence. Victoria had been selected for the magazine's cover story about women who had transformed personal crises into business opportunities that created positive social change. The article would focus on how she had evolved from a victim of financial fraud into an advocate for other women facing similar situations. Margaret, do you remember what I told that reporter from the Wall Street Journal last month? Refresh my memory. I said that the best revenge is not destruction, it's transformation. Richard thought he could steal my money and my identity. Instead, he gave me the motivation to become someone far more powerful than I had ever been as his wife. Victoria finished her coffee and prepared to leave for the interview that would position her as a national spokesperson for women's financial rights. The Foundation had already attracted attention from celebrities, politicians, and business leaders who recognized the importance of helping women protect themselves from financial manipulation. You know what I've learned through this entire experience, Victoria said as she stood to leave. Some women are born fighters. Others have fighting thrust upon them by circumstances they never anticipated. But either way, we have the capacity to not just survive, but to transform our lives in ways that seemed impossible before we were tested. Margaret hugged her goodbye with the warmth of someone who had witnessed Victoria's complete transformation, from dismissed wife to formidable business leader and social advocate. As Victoria walked toward her car, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from Richard's study to this cafe in Brooklyn. The woman who had been pushed out of that business meeting 8 months earlier had been uncertain, gradually disappearing under years of dismissive treatment and financial manipulation. This woman was someone Victoria recognized from her early career, decisive, strategic, and absolutely committed to using her success to create opportunities for other women facing similar challenges. The Foundation's first client had been a woman whose husband was hiding assets in offshore accounts during their divorce proceedings. Victoria had been able to connect her with forensic accountants and federal investigators who discovered a fraud scheme that had been operating for over 5 years. Some women are born fighters, Victoria said to herself as she drove back toward Manhattan. Others have fighting thrust upon them. Either way, we always find a way to win. Her phone rang with a call from a producer at CNN who wanted to discuss Victoria's appearance on a segment about financial abuse in high-income marriages. The story of her successful prosecution of Richard had resonated with women across the country who recognized similar patterns in their own relationships. Victoria answered the call with the confidence of someone who had learned that her most devastating personal crisis could become the foundation for her most meaningful professional achievement. She was no longer Richard Blackwood's wife, struggling to maintain relevance in her own marriage. She was Victoria Blackwood, majority owner of a successful technology company, founder of a national foundation for women's financial independence, and living proof that being underestimated could be the greatest advantage of all. The woman who had once felt invisible had become impossible to ignore, and she was just getting started.